Chapter 7. The Taste.
Tiffany understood when Scott had to go on a business trip. Although he was not fond of telling her the lie, he also understood its necessity. They rode out that morning. It was cool out, and the cold felt good as they got onto the highway. Although they knew that they were not being followed, just to be safe, they rode to the airport and then back to Thoraine's house, and they pulled up to the gate. They rode up the driveway. They parked in the garage and closed the doors. They walked into the house. Taylor had called the number that Thoraine had left for the staff. He did not have to say much. Taylor showed Scott around, spending a long time looking at and talking in the room with the time lock. Then they went to the kitchen to assess what they would need to get at the grocery store, and then they found that they would not have to go at all. There was plenty of food. Scott picked up another envelope from the table. He opened it. "Read it out loud," Taylor said. "Okay. Dear Scott and Taylor, I will not lie to you. The taste is the hardest part of the conversion, but I know you will be fine. You are both stronger than you know. As always, feel free to get whatever you need. There is a cigar tin in my desk in the entertainment room. You will find cigarettes in the cellar. There is wine and beer in there as well, but you may want to be careful. Alcohol can be dangerous. Make yourself at home. Thoraine," Scott finished. They walked around the house, exploring it a bit more in depth. They found a cigar tin, and as they expected, it did not have cigars in it. They had a joint while they were in the room. Both Scott and Taylor were on edge. The upcoming night weighed heavy on both of them, but the smoke helped calm them down and increase their resolve. There was a library in the house, this one stocked with only conventional titles, but Taylor was happy he would be able to read a great deal in the days to come. Scott was a bit restless until they walked into the entertainment room. Then he had a very large smile on his face as he looked at the 60-inch television with Xbox attached. Looking at the shelves next to the mammoth screen, he found the largest selection of games he had ever seen. Scott happily played the afternoon away. "I even play video games better," Scott bragged, and then ran his car into a wall in the game he was playing. Taylor laughed. "Yeah, I can see that," Taylor replied. He decided to return to the library. Taylor looked at book after book, trying to figure out which ones he would be able to read in the allotted time. Outside, dusk started to come over Salt Lake City. As the skies flared into orange in the west, the lights of the night started to come out. The valley looked like a jewelry box with lights twinkling. Soon, it was time for Scott to go on the hunt. They sat on the back deck of the house watching the sunset. They finished their cigarettes that they were having and walked into the house. Scott called Tiffany. Thoraine's phone had the number that reported unlisted on the caller ID, and he told her it was exciting and that they were going out for the evening. She wished him luck. Scott felt guilty after the call, but soon realized that there were much more pressing matters. They left a half an hour later in a car that was in the garage. Once again, Thoraine supplied them with all the tools they needed. As they pulled out of the gate and into the city streets, Taylor could not help but wonder about Thoraine. Thoraine always seemed to predict what they would need and had it waiting for them. There was something more to Thoraine, and that Taylor knew for sure. Taylor drove and Scott navigated. They had been driving for over an hour when suddenly a feeling came over Scott. "Go right here," he said. Taylor followed the directions and he pulled into a small dark alley. Taylor heard a scream and Scott burst from the door. Taylor was out. Scott ripped a man off a girl so hard he flipped him into a wall and then slid down. "You need to leave," Scott said to the girl. "Thank you," she said and ran. She had never seen anyone do anything like Scott had just done. Scott swooped down on the rapist. Scott plunged into his neck and drank deeply. The blood coursed through him. Scott dropped the man and he fell dead. "Need to go," Scott said. Taylor hurried him into the car and they drove into the night. On the drive home, Scott became more and more agitated. Taylor was starting to get worried about him getting all the way to the house. However, they did make it. Taylor was able to get Scott into the room. As soon as he was in the locked room, Scott started pounding on the walls. Soon, he was in an all-out rage and there was no sign of the old Scott. just an animal that scraped and clawed at the walls. Taylor listened for a while and then went upstairs and wound up reading the first night away. The second night, Scott was starting to calm. Taylor stayed with Scott the entire time, although he did read because Scott was not much for conversation. They spent their time with Scott either quiet and sullen or in an all-out fight against his personal demons. Taylor sat by the door and read, leaving only to get a drink or a new book. It tore him up to listen to Scott in that much anguish, but he was smart enough to know that at this point there was nothing to do but wait. And wait he did, and finally, in the end, the time lock ticked away its last few seconds, and then with a heavy clunk, the door swung open and Scott came out of the room. He looked strong. He had a much stronger presence than he had had before. Taylor and Scott embraced. "Your turn," Scott said, then he smiled. "I need a smoke." And then they went out to the elaborate deck off the back of the house and both lit a cigarette. Taylor looked at Scott. "Well?" he asked. "Well, what?" "What's it like?" Taylor asked. "It sucks ass big time, but you'll be fine." "Wow, you're as full of information as Theraint was," Taylor grumbled. "Sorry, man, it's just hard to describe. You'll understand soon enough," Scott said and looked out into the valley. Taylor left it at that. He could see by the look in Scott's eyes that it had been difficult for him. They went back inside, and they sat and played Xbox during the day. As the sun sank yet again in the horizon, the two slipped into the night. They got into the car again, and this time Scott drove while Taylor navigated. It took longer than the last time, but finally Taylor started offering quick directions. They pulled into an apartment complex. "Come with me," Taylor asked. Scott answered by getting out of the car. Taylor walked right up to the door and rang the bell. The door opened a little, and Taylor thrust his hand and broke the chain, hitting the man and knocking him out. They moved inside. "How the hell do you know he did anything?" Scott asked. And then the smell hit him. He gagged, and all around the house were corpses in different poses. The couple on the couch watching TV. Man reading a paper. A young girl in the kitchen eating cereal. Throughout the house there were over 20 bodies. "Do it, and let's get the fuck out of here." Taylor launched into the man and drained him. "Let's go," Taylor growled, dropping the body. Scott grabbed Taylor and helped him to the car. Taylor held himself in check the whole time. They pulled into the house, and Taylor walked into the room under his own power. Scott set the time lock, and he went to sit down. "I'm okay. You don't have to stay. Go and relax," Taylor said. All right," Scott replied, sensing that Taylor wanted to be alone. Taylor went through his entire blood detox without a scream or a fight. He did not speak either. Scott spent most of the days playing games. Taylor fought his demons in private and in silence. A few times when Scott had checked in on him, he had been crying. However, he got the absolute impression that this is exactly how Taylor wanted to go through this. Normally, Scott would have been concerned, but this was Taylor. And it seemed as long as he had known Taylor, Taylor always knew what Taylor needed. He had always been the responsible one. From the moment they had met when they were young, Scott had always looked up to him. He was always calm and thought out his next move. The third day finally came along. Scott had come down 20 minutes before the time lock released. "You okay?" Taylor asked, the first thing he had said in 3 days. Yeah, I played some Xbox and hung out," Scott said, amazed. "You're the one that was in here, remember?" he said, shaking his head. Taylor shrugged. "How long do I have left? I need a smoke," he asked. Scott laughed and looked at the pad. 10 minutes, he replied. They tried to speak through the last 10 minutes, but there was a lot of silence until the lock clunked again. With a hiss, the door released and Taylor stepped out and embraced Scott. The power felt like a wave, and even Scott could tell that he was more powerful than your average vampire, even though he had met very few. They hugged each other. The ordeal was over. "Let's not do that again soon," Scott said. "I hope not," Taylor said. Still, something in him said that this would not be the hardest thing that would happen. "Let's go smoke," Taylor said, and they headed for the back porch. They sat in the evening light and watched the sun go over the valley. "Wow, you can really feel the difference, can't you?" Taylor observed his enhanced powers. "Yeah, but I have a feeling it's a bit different for you." "You seemed real powerful before, but now," Scott said and blew out his breath. "Oh, really?" Taylor asked. At that second, Taylor's power dimmed, and soon it was completely hidden to Scott. "How did you do that?" Scott asked. "Do what?" "I could feel your power, and then it drained away," Scott said. Taylor shrugged. "I just thought that I'd have to try to find a way to hide that," Taylor replied. Scott shook his head in disbelief. They finished their cigarettes and packed up. It was close to 10 o'clock, and then they got on their bikes after locking up the house. They rode back to the airport and returned to Scott's apartment. Tiffany and Amy were waiting outside for them, and after they were parked, they were both assaulted by hugs. Scott and Tiffany sharing a long kiss as Taylor and Amy smiled on. They partied that night at home, Taylor and Scott using the "after the long trip they'd rather stay inside" excuse. They all wound up drinking far too much, and they talked about the new job. They made it so it would be easy to take days and even weeks and months to go do what they needed. They drank and smoked well into the night, and the other topic they talked about a lot was Scott and the announcement that they would begin house shopping. Tiffany was not at all expecting the announcement, but could not help going over all the things she wanted in a house, and Scott and Taylor and mostly Amy offering ideas. It was a wonderful night. Taylor even spent the night knowing he was above his limit. Even with his enhanced abilities, he decided it would be better if he stayed the night.